So thank you, Charisse, and thank you, John, for that wonderful presentation. So my presentation is about defining student learning outcomes. So I have two outcomes for this session. By the end of that session, I hope the participants would be able to list the steps of backward design. And hopefully you can get some ideas to develop meaningful and measurable learning outcomes for your projects. So let me first talk a little bit about the fundamental elements of a backward design. Usually, as Charisse said, as language teachers, what is of forefront importance to us is developing learners' language proficiency and intercultural competence. Some of us, when we start teaching, we start thinking about, all these topics in the textbook that we have to cover, and we have to just go through them and then test students, quiz students by the end of each of the modules or units. But backward design really is telling us that let's stop. First, think about what are the real world tasks or functions that students need to perform. So what is worthy and requiring of learning? And then think about what evidence of learning that we can solicit from the learners. After that, so after we think about the evidence of learning students can demonstrate, then we develop the learning activities, scaffolding activities to promote learning interest and excellence. I think backward design works very well with project-based language learning. What those three steps that I just shared with you can translate it into, first, we need to develop student learning outcomes to perform real-world tasks. As Charisse said, that is, don't think about all those language functions first, think about engaging a project first. And that is true because it's almost like if you can think of an engaging, meaningful, and a significant project, we can actually think about what kind of functions, communicative functions that we want students to gain through performing various real-world tasks to achieve those projects. So they kind of go hand in hand. You can choose your project. Let's just say, Charisse gave us example of developing, for example, like a manual, a food manual. She used it as a dessert project. But this project can actually be developed into a real world tasks if your interest is to develop students' proficiency as to describe cultural element, form hypothesis, do contrast and comparison, and present your ideas. So you can develop various scaffolding tasks. For example, the students can interview native speakers. So therefore, they're able to perform that interactive communicative function to inquire about what are the authentic dishes in the native speakers or target people living in the target country, right? So you can develop these tasks, but first think about what are the proficiency and intercultural outcomes that you want students to achieve first. And given the understanding that students are developing in various stages, in the beginning, they probably can perform a little bit of basic functions as describing in short sentences and phrases, but later they can do more contrast, the comparison, forming hypothesis, criticize, debate, and so on and so forth. So keep those communicative functions and intercultural competencies in mind when you start thinking about developing scaffolding tasks for your project. But in the end, after we develop those student learning outcomes, we need to think about what is that product that we ask students to show, to produce, that can demonstrate their performance on these outcomes. You cannot use a product where students give you a one-page, like a summary of a paragraph to evaluate students' ability to interact with native speakers, right? So you have to use more like interview tasks with the students to assess their interaction, communicative abilities. Then you develop various learning. After you develop those assessment tasks, usually in project-based language learning, the tasks are public product. Usually they're public products where students demonstrate their final product, and sometimes including student reflections to show what they have learned and how they have learned to achieve some of the dispositional outcomes that we want students to achieve, especially related to intercultural competencies. And then we develop these scaffolding learning activities. So let me go on to give you the definition of student learning outcomes. Basically, student learning outcomes are action-oriented statements of the knowledge, skills, and/or dispositions students are expected to know, to be able to do, or value upon successful course completion. As language teachers, I think the skills and dispositions are extremely important. In terms of the knowledge, those are knowledge vocabularies, knowledge of grammar, knowledge of target cultural elements, and so on and so forth. But it's more of the skills and dispositions that we try to cultivate in our students, especially dispositions, because it's closely related to intercultural competencies. Dispositions such as be tentative when presenting one's arguments or positions, or see one's own world views through the views of others, be able to suspend one's assumptions when presenting, be able to compare and contrast. So these kind of dispositional outcomes are particularly important for language teachers. So let me give you an example of, let me illustrate the different components of SLO. So first, SLO always start with students will be able to, or students can, students will. Then it has an action verb. As Cherie said, those action verb, you can use the action verb to represent the students' proficiency developmental stages. At the lower developmental stages, students can do list, label, describe. At a higher level, they can analyze, compare, hypothesize, synthesize, propose, integrate, and research. So there's more verbs on our website, and I'm sure Cherise is going to share her resource with you as well. And the third is about the learning domain. Language teachers, we encounter two learning domains. One of them is content. For example, if we ask students to research on endangered animals or people eating endangered animals on this topic, obviously that is a content. And in terms of the language, there will be describing about the status of endangered animals. So the description is the language, be able to challenge and debate, be able to promote, advocate. Those are kind of the language functions that we expect students to perform. Let me give you an example. So this one, it said students will be able to describe. So describe is the action verb. Important cultural elements and writing style in children's book of the target culture. So this project is for the students to develop children's books for the people in the target country. So then students first, they need to understand what the genre is like, right? What are the students, like me, I'm from China, so if I'm teaching my students, so I will ask them to read some children's books and identify the genre elements of the children's books in that target culture. They can do so in using short phrases and sentences. And sometimes if they're beginning level language learners, I would give them formulaic expressions in the beginning for them to be able to do the task. Everybody, as Stephen said in the beginning, if you're interested in applying for the Summer Institute, on the blueprint, you'll be asked to put in both the content SLO and language SLO. So in terms of the example that I just presented, the content SLO would be describe important cultural elements and writing style of children's books. In terms of the language SLO, we could say use short phrases and sentences, and so on and so forth. Another example, students will be able to compare and contrast. So compare and contrast are action verbs, and they're also directly linked with the Act for World Readiness standard. Compare and contrast the similarities and differences in common cultural values, portrait in children's books of one's own culture and the target culture. And the language domain is using short sentences and formulaic expressions with high frequency vocabulary. And on the blueprint, and so you can separate the content SLO and the language SLO. Notice that in language SLO, we can have some examples, right? High frequency words can include love, friends, parents, and using transitional words to express comparisons, because we ask students to do compare and contrast. So to make your SLO measurable, again, we need to think about using these action verbs and using the world readiness standards, and some examples from the standards can help us to do this. I gave you some action verbs here, like synthesize, list, discover, describe, explain, and so on and so forth. Some of the tasks kind of represent a lower level cognitive tasks, like list, explain, describe. Some of the verbs represent a more higher level cognitive task, like synthesize, debate, reflect, hypothesize, so on and so forth. So that is how to make your SLOs measurable. The next topic is how to make your SLOs meaningful. To make your SLOs meaningful, we have to think about the tasks to perform to meet the features of PBLL. So those including the significant content, challenging problem, or challenging driving question, significant driving question, engaging student success skills, teamwork, communication, collaboration, sustained inquiry. Let's learn about this topic first and then ask more questions, and what are more phenomena or different perspectives that we can pursue, and in the end have a public product. So think about the different tasks that students need to engage to complete the project. Let me give you an example. For example, my colleague Jiang Song, he is teaching this internship program for Chinese language learners, where they're training the learners to perform as the interns in Hawaiian airline. So in this project, there are very salient tasks. For example, students have to explain these different regulations and policies, like this child seat restriction. They need to explain names of the airports. They need to talk about emergency row. What do you have to perform in terms of if you're sitting in the emergency row? Okay, so looks simple enough. But if you actually look at some of the tasks students have to perform, take this as example, inquiry and fulfill customers' needs. Not only students need to understand what are the common inquiries that emerge in the airline situation or waiting room or on airplane, they need to be able to problem solve. For example, the customer may ask, why is that person in front of me got this seat and I don't get this seat? So they need to understand, they need to problem solve, they need to understand the roots of the problem, they need to understand who to talk to in what situation, and then they need to communicate the resolution back to the customer in a way that is culturally appropriate. They cannot just say, oh, because of this. They say, I understand your frustration. I understand that, thank you for your patience, and so on and so forth. So if you start to really analyze what is required behind these tasks, that can help you to unpack the skills that students are required to perform. So let me give you an example. For example, in this, there are many SLOs related to this task. So I just give you one example. In terms of content, students is asked to do, in this case, critical thinking. They have to examine business situations and apply airline industry's rules and regulations to provide professional problem-solving solutions to customers. So that is the content. But they need to ask questions, ask clarifications, and clarify ambiguities, propose solutions using socially appropriate, polite, and professional language. So that is one example in terms of SLOs and how you write SLOs. So let me give you another example. So this time it's your turn. So think about, in many of the projects that I have encountered, the teacher will ask, the instructor will ask the students to interview a member of the community in the target culture. So in terms of an interview task or interview project, what can be some of the outcomes that you can think of? Give you 1 minute. Okay. So I know you couldn't answer me in this webinar, but basically, you know, most common outcomes coming out of an interview task would that students will be able to ask those interview questions. Or maybe students be able to summarize the interview responses. Okay, so those would be the common kind of outcomes that, you know, when people first think about the interview task, what are the student learning outcomes? But if you actually think about it, in terms of students having to organize the interviews, students have to kind of perform a little bit of project management. So in terms of that, that is a real life skill, right? So like, you know, we work in higher education, we know that scheduling meetings is one of the most significant tasks required of us. So for example, one outcome related to management, project management would be students are able to recruit volunteers to participate in the interview, schedule interview time and place, and follow up with reminders and thank you messages in culturally appropriate manner. So that is one example. Other language or content related skills could be that students are able to grade, you know, you have to grade people politely, ask questions, ask for elaboration, and perform leave taking. You cannot just say, okay, bye, I'm done, right? You have to perform all of these communicative functions to make it culturally appropriate. Interview tasks can allow students to also perform a higher level communicative functions. For example, one of the example outcome can be students are able to form qualified hypotheses of cultural elements or target community members' needs in the community. Qualified hypothesis means that if they only interview 3 people, they have to make their hypothesis based on the limitation of the number of people that interviewing, for example. Another complex outcome can be that students are able to describe the mean passage, categorize responses in logical manner, summarize and synthesize the findings from the different interviews, and resolve controversies of the findings reviewed from the interview task, right? So these are so think about, even if you think about a simple task, unpack that task, unpack the skills, language skills, so that you can properly scaffold student learning. That is a good segue to talk about the next point about making your SLOs meaningful. It has to be appropriate for learners' cognitive and linguistic development. Again, I'm giving you a task. Now read the list of verbs in the yellow highlighted and then read the verbs in the blue highlighted list. And tell me which one present a lower level cognitive level task and which one represent a higher level task. And you know, it's very obvious. It's the ones in yellow that shows a lower level cognitive task, and the ones in the blue shows more higher level tasks. It does not mean that we cannot ask students to perform a higher cognitive level task. It just means that we have to scaffold learning appropriately. So we ask them to do the lower level tasks before we ask them to do things like estimate. For students to estimate, they first probably have to locate the things and list all the sources they need to use to estimate, and then describe it, and then they can estimate. So that just talks about the importance of scaffolding our learners, the importance of the scaffold. The third point that I'm trying to make is to make your SLOs meaningful, as Charisse also said, is to align it with national standards and established evaluation criteria. So Charisse mentioned about standards, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the evaluation criteria. Of course, one of the most important standards that we need to consider as language instructors is to look to world readiness standards of learning languages. Thinking about designing our task in a way so they can ask students to do both interpersonal communication, interpretive communication, and presentational communication. Intercultural competence is also very, very important. So I have, I think, 2 pages of example student learning outcomes for you to consider after this webinar. So let me give you an example. Again, in that airline internship project, one of the outcomes is that students will investigate and reflect on cross-cultural differences and possible conflicts as a result of such differences. So they need to investigate and reflect and thinking about differences, right? So here it touches on 2 standard elements, culture and comparison. We also need to think about the proficiency development. For some universities and schools language programs, they probably are required for students to meet certain level of active proficiency standards. So that's something to think about as well. In the end, one valuable rubric that people often neglect are the established standards, using these standards or criteria to serve as your student learning outcomes. I'm more familiar with higher education because I have been working with in the higher education all my career. And one of the valuable source is called Valid Assessment of Learning in Undergraduate Education. It's from the American Association of Colleges and Universities, value rubric. And I know of in K-12, valuable resources is the Common Core standards. So people can go to this link, which will be made available later. But let me go back to the value rubric. So value rubric has 16 rubric. It's a set of rubric of 16 individual rubrics. It is developed by hundreds of instructors across many, many universities. Value rubric is widely used in the United States and sometimes in Canada as well, universities in Canada, for institutional assessment purposes. That being said, it means if you're using it, you have to make it more specific to your class or program situation. But look at these important, you can call it success skills. And at University of Hawaii at Manoa, we are accredited by WASC, and some of these critical thinking, information literacy, quantitative reasoning, oral and written communication, we also call them WASC core competencies that every single university must demonstrate, that every single student must meet these core competencies. So if you look at these rubric, each rubric has criteria or elements of the rubric. And these standards or criteria can be used to form student learning outcomes in your course. For example, this is one example about intercultural knowledge and competence. It talks about students be able to initiate and develop interactions with culturally different others, suspend judgment in valuing his or her interactions with culturally different others. So these rubric standards, we can directly just use them in our course at student learning outcomes. Okay. As I'm preparing for this presentation today, I was reviewing some of the project in our project repository, and I noticed there's some common tasks. And maybe project is not the correct term. Maybe there are more like tasks that people use in their projects, like interview, research, meaning they are reading newspapers, they're reading articles, they're looking at movies or ads or those research kind of tasks. There's a guide writing task, like writing a tour guide, writing a student success guide for the first year international students. And also I reviewed a book on cultura, and I noticed and composed 2 pages of interculturally focused SLOs. So I have the link of the SLOs under each of these tasks and the interculturally focused SLOs in this link, which will be shared to you. And of course, these SLOs not meant to be exclusive, and it's not meant to be used all together at once because, or like 5 pages of them. So choose the ones, look at them, choose the ones that you think is appropriate for your project and the communicative goal that you try to have students reach, use as appropriate. And if you can think of others, suggest to me and I can add it to it so it can benefit all the people participating in this webinar. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to provide a brief summary of this webinar. First, I talked about the backward design. Backward design first involving us thinking about what are the communicative functions we want students to be able to perform, what are the intercultural competencies we want students to gain, defining that learning outcomes first, and then think about what is the assessment tasks that we want students to show. In project-based language learning, very often that is a public product that you want students to perform in the very end, accompanied by student reflections. Learning activities are the scaffolding activities that we have students do. Interviews, do background research, and so on and so forth. And then we move on to talk about SLOs, how to make SLOs measurable. We talked about using action verbs, and action verbs represent different cognitive tasks, from lower level cognitive tasks to higher level cognitive tasks. And we talk about how to make your SLOs meaningful. Think about the real world task student has to perform. Unpack that skills and knowledge so that you can make sure that students can achieve the tasks that you want them to achieve. Think about the learner development, scaffold learners from first performing more cognitively simple tasks to more cognitively complex tasks. Think about using the standards and establish the criteria in a lot of nationally accepted rubrics. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm going to, here is my email, yao.hill@hawaii.edu. If you have questions, I can stay here and answer any of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yao.